October 24, 1944. Commander David McCampbell grips the control stick of his Grumman F6F Hellcat, tail number 7143, as he roars off the flight deck of the USS Essex. His fuel gauge reads half full. Not enough. Not nearly enough for what's coming, but the radar operators have spotted them a massive formation of Japanese aircraft, 60 strong, bearing down on the American carriers steaming through the Philippine Sea. McCampbell's wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, forms up on his right. Just 2 Hellcats against 60 enemy aircraft. The mathematics seem suicidal. Yet what unfolds over the next 90 minutes will shatter every assumption about aerial combat, about technological superiority, and about what a single skilled pilot in the right aircraft can achieve against overwhelming odds. This is not just the story of an American record that still stands today. This is the story of how Japan's naval aviation, once the terror of the Pacific, had devolved into something unrecognizable from the elite force that struck Pearl Harbor, and how one man in one Hellcat would demonstrate, with devastating clarity, that the war in the air was already over. The morning began with confusion. Admiral Frederick Sherman had explicitly forbidden McCampbell from flying combat missions that day. The commander of Air Group 15, the fabled 15, was too valuable, too prominent. With 21 confirmed kills already painted beneath his cockpit, McCampbell had become the Navy's most famous living aviator. Losing him would be a propaganda disaster. But when the squawk box in the ready room boomed, "All available fighter pilots, man your planes," McCampbell made a decision. He was available. He headed for Mincy 3, his personal Hellcat waiting on the flight deck. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The F6F Hellcat that McCampbell climbed into that morning represented 3 years of American industrial and engineering evolution. When the war began, Japanese Zero fighters had dominated Pacific skies with impunity. The Mitsubishi A6M possessed legendary maneuverability, exceptional range, and in the hands of experienced pilots, had proven nearly invincible against early American fighters. But the Hellcat changed everything. Designed specifically to counter the Zero using captured aircraft and combat reports, Grumman engineers had created something fundamentally different. While the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the Hellcat embraced a different philosophy entirely. 212 pounds of armor plating surrounded McCampbell's cockpit. Self-sealing fuel tanks would prevent the catastrophic fires that destroyed Zeros. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds, provided devastating firepower that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine beneath the Hellcat's cowling produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Zero's output. This power translated into speed, climb rate, and high-altitude performance that Japanese fighters simply couldn't match. At altitude, where combat would unfold that morning, the Hellcat's superiority would prove overwhelming. McCampbell understood his aircraft intimately. Since taking command of Air Group 15 in February 1944, he had flown multiple Hellcats, Monsoon Maiden, destroyed by enemy fire on its first mission. Then Mincy, Mincy 2, and now Mincy 3. Each aircraft had proven its worth. The Hellcat forgave mistakes, absorbed punishment, and delivered consistent performance regardless of conditions. But what made the Hellcat truly revolutionary wasn't just its specifications. It was the systematic approach to its employment. American radar systems detected enemy aircraft at 100 miles, providing advanced warning impossible for Japanese forces. Fighter director officers aboard the carriers vectored defending Hellcats to optimal intercept positions using real-time radio communications. This integration of technology, tactics, and command control transformed carrier defense from reactive scrambling to coordinated systematic interception. Japan possessed none of these advantages. Their radar systems, when they worked at all, provided perhaps 60 miles of detection range with poor reliability. Without fighter direction capabilities, Japanese combat air patrols operated independently, unable to concentrate forces effectively. Their radio equipment produced constant static and interference, forcing many pilots to simply turn them off. More critically, by October 1944, Japan had lost the trained pilots who might have compensated for technological disadvantages. The elite aviators who attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, and swept across the Pacific were mostly dead. Their replacements averaged perhaps 100 hours total flight time before entering combat. They had never fired weapons at aerial targets. They understood combat tactics only theoretically. They were, in essence, sacrificial offerings sent against an enemy they had no capability to defeat. As McCampbell climbed toward the intercept, his radar-equipped controllers provided precise information. 60 aircraft, bearing west-northwest, altitude 24,000 feet, distance closing rapidly. The formation consisted of approximately 40 fighters, Zeros and Nakajima Oscars, escorting perhaps 20 dive bombers and torpedo planes. 5 other Hellcats from Air Group 15 joined the intercept, bringing the total American force to 7 fighters. McCampbell made the tactical decision instantly. 5 Hellcats would dive on the bombers, breaking up their attack formation before they could threaten the carriers. He and Rushing would engage the 40 fighters alone. The mathematics seemed insane, 2 against 40. But McCampbell understood something the Japanese pilots approaching did not. Numbers meant nothing if you couldn't bring those numbers to bear effectively, and in 1944, Japanese fighter pilots simply lacked the capability to coordinate complex aerial combat. At 25,000 feet, McCampbell spotted the enemy formation. The Japanese fighters flew in tight parade ground precision, maintaining formation discipline that looked impressive but proved tactically useless. They made no attempt to spread out, to assign covering sections, to establish tactical flexibility. They simply flew straight toward their target, maintaining neat rows that would have pleased peacetime instructors. This formation discipline reflected Japanese training philosophy that emphasized obedience and precision over tactical adaptation. Pilots learned to maintain position regardless of circumstances. Breaking formation without explicit orders was considered disgraceful, a failure of warrior spirit. This cultural rigidity, which had served Japan well in the era of samurai warfare, proved catastrophic against systematic American tactics. McCampbell and Rushing climbed above the Japanese formation, gaining the altitude advantage that would prove decisive. The Japanese pilots, fixated on their bomber escort mission, failed to maintain effective lookout. No one noticed the 2 Hellcats positioning 4,000 feet above them. Energy tactics, the systematic exploitation of altitude and speed advantages, had become doctrine for American pilots by mid-1944. The concept was simple: convert altitude to speed through diving attacks. Use that speed to zoom back to altitude before enemies could respond. Never engage in low-speed turning fights where Japanese maneuverability might matter. Dictate engagement terms absolutely. The Japanese pilots climbing toward the American carriers expected conventional combat. They anticipated the Americans would attempt to dogfight, to prove their warrior skill through individual combat prowess. Japanese training emphasized aerobatic ability and fighting spirit. Their tactics assumed enemies would accept combat on those terms. They were catastrophically wrong. McCampbell had no intention of fighting a fair fight. Fair fights killed pilots. Smart fights, where you exploited every advantage while denying the enemy opportunities to use his strengths, won wars. At 10:30 in the morning, McCampbell rolled inverted and dove. The Hellcat accelerated rapidly, reaching 450 miles per hour as it plummeted toward the Japanese formation. Rushing followed, maintaining position slightly behind and to the side, ready to cover his leader's attack. The first Zero never knew what hit it. McCampbell's 6 50 caliber guns converged their fire in a focused stream that struck the enemy fighter's wing root. The Zero's notoriously fragile structure, designed for minimum weight rather than battle damage resistance, disintegrated under the hammer blow of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Within 2 seconds, flames erupted from ruptured fuel tanks. The Zero rolled inverted and fell toward the ocean 5 miles below. McCampbell zoomed back to altitude before any Japanese pilot could react. The attack had taken perhaps 6 seconds from start to finish. 1 enemy destroyed, 59 remaining. The odds had barely changed, but the psychological impact on the Japanese formation was devastating. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks. Pilots who had never experienced systematic high-side attacks suddenly realized they faced something completely beyond their training. Some broke formation instinctively, attempting to escape. Others froze, maintaining position while frantically scanning for the attackers they couldn't locate. A few tried to climb, but the Zero's mediocre climb rate at altitude meant they simply made themselves easier targets. The Japanese formation, so disciplined moments before, began fragmenting, and once it fragmented, it was doomed. McCampbell and Rushing could engage individual aircraft without worrying about coordinated defensive responses. The prey had scattered. The hunt began in earnest. For the next 10 minutes, the 2 Hellcats worked methodically. Dive, fire, kill, zoom away. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Japanese pilots attempted to turn into the attacks, but at 400 miles per hour, their controls locked up. The Zero's large ailerons and elevators, so responsive at low speeds, became nearly immovable in high-speed flight. Pilots yanked desperately on control sticks that felt welded in place while American guns tore them apart. Some Japanese pilots managed to get their aircraft pointed toward the Hellcats, but closing speed made accurate gunnery impossible. Their bullets streamed harmlessly past, while McCampbell's disciplined 3-second bursts found their marks with devastating regularity. The technological gap had created a turkey shoot where one side hunted while the other simply died. By 10:45, McCampbell had destroyed 5 Japanese fighters. Rushing had accounted for 3 more, 8 enemies down in 15 minutes. But the engagement was far from over. The surviving Japanese pilots, watching their squadmates fall in flames, faced an impossible decision. Their training demanded they continue the mission, escort the bombers to target, fulfill their duty regardless of cost. Their survival instinct screamed to run, to dive for the deck, to do anything except remain in this killing zone. Some chose duty. They maintained formation, flying straight ahead while the twin-tailed devils above them selected victims methodically. These pilots died fulfilling their orders, shot out of the sky by an enemy who gave them no chance to demonstrate the combat prowess they'd trained to display. Their courage was absolute, their effectiveness was 0. Others chose survival. They broke formation, abandoning the bombers, diving toward the relative safety of lower altitudes. But diving meant giving up any altitude advantage they might have regained. It meant converting themselves from fighters into fleeing targets. And the Hellcat's superior diving speed meant there was no escape. The Japanese fighters that attempted to flee discovered another Hellcat advantage. The heavy American fighter could dive faster than the lightweight Zero. What seemed like escape was merely delayed death. McCampbell and Rushing followed them down, closed the distance, and destroyed them methodically. By 11 o'clock, the Japanese formation had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Individual aircraft scattered across the sky, each pilot focused solely on survival. The bombers, stripped of fighter protection, turned back toward their bases without attacking. The mission had failed completely, but McCampbell wasn't finished. His ammunition counters showed plenty of rounds remaining. His fuel gauge showed less. The half-full tanks at takeoff had dropped to a quarter full. He had perhaps 45 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe less if he continued high-speed combat maneuvering. The decision should have been obvious. Break off, return to the carrier, mission accomplished. But below him, dozens of Japanese fighters were attempting to flee, stringing out in a ragged line toward their bases on Luzon. And McCampbell realized he had an unprecedented opportunity. These weren't the elite pilots of 1942 who had dominated Pacific skies. These were teenagers with barely 100 hours of flight training, sent into combat in obsolete aircraft against technologically superior enemies. They had no chance, and McCampbell intended to prove that point with mathematical certainty. He pushed the throttle forward and began hunting. What followed over the next 60 minutes would be described by historians as one of the most one-sided aerial combats ever recorded. Not because McCampbell possessed supernatural skill, though his ability was undeniable, but because the disparity between American and Japanese capabilities had grown so vast that the term combat hardly applied. The chase became a running execution. Japanese pilots, their fuel tanks hemorrhaging from previous damage, couldn't maintain high speed. Their aircraft, never designed for sustained high-altitude operations, began experiencing mechanical failures. Engines sputtered. Controls became erratic. Some pilots simply ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Those who still had functioning aircraft discovered that even running away was impossible. The Hellcat was faster. Every time a Japanese pilot thought he'd gained distance, McCampbell would appear behind him again, guns blazing. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical destruction. By 11:15, McCampbell had destroyed his 8th enemy aircraft. By 11:30, his 9th. Both Zeros, caught from behind as they fled, exploded when 50 caliber rounds ignited their unprotected fuel tanks. Neither pilot had opportunity to evade, neither had opportunity to fight back. They simply died, 2 more casualties of an aerial war that Japan had already lost. Rushing, staying with McCampbell throughout the pursuit, destroyed 3 more enemy fighters, bringing his total to 6 for the mission. Together, the 2 Hellcat pilots had accounted for 15 Japanese aircraft, a feat unmatched in American aviation history. But the kills meant less than what they represented. 15 trained pilots lost, 15 aircraft destroyed, 15 more gaps in Japanese formations that could not be filled, and this was just one engagement, on one morning, in a war that saw such slaughter repeated daily. McCampbell glanced at his fuel gauge. The needle hovered near empty. His ammunition counters showed 2 rounds remaining in one gun, empty in the others. Time to go home. The return flight became an exercise in anxiety management. The Essex's flight deck was crowded with aircraft, preventing immediate landing. Controllers vectored McCampbell to the USS Langley, a light carrier operating nearby. He approached cautiously, his engine sputtering as it began consuming the last drops of fuel from his tanks. The carrier landing was perfect. He'd made hundreds of them. The tailhook grabbed the arresting wire, jerking the Hellcat to a halt in the standard bone-jarring deceleration every carrier pilot knew intimately. The engine died immediately, not from McCampbell shutting it down, but from complete fuel exhaustion. The deck crew had to manually push the Hellcat out of the landing area because there wasn't enough fuel remaining to taxi. When maintenance personnel inspected the aircraft, they discovered 2 rounds remaining in one 50 caliber gun. Everything else was expended. The belly tank showed empty. The main tanks showed empty. McCampbell had flown his aircraft to absolute limits and returned with nothing to spare. In 90 minutes of sustained combat, Commander David McCampbell had shot down 9 Japanese aircraft, 7 Zeros and 2 Oscars, setting an American single-mission record that stands to this day. Combined with his wingman's 6 kills, 2 pilots had destroyed 15 enemy aircraft without loss. The mission would earn McCampbell the Medal of Honor, but the deeper significance extended far beyond individual heroism. October 24, 1944, marked the point where American aerial superiority became so overwhelming that Japanese pilots were no longer combatants but victims, and their presence in the sky more ceremonial than threatening. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which this air combat was part of, would see the last organized resistance by Japanese naval aviation. After October 1944, Japan's carrier-based air power ceased to exist as a meaningful military force. The pilots were dead. The aircraft were destroyed. The training programs couldn't replace losses faster than American fighters inflicted them. But understanding how this catastrophic imbalance developed requires looking beyond a single engagement. It requires examining the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation that occurred over 3 years of brutal attrition warfare. It requires understanding technological evolution, industrial capacity, training philosophy, and tactical adaptation. Most importantly, it requires understanding what happened to the men who flew Zeros, who believed in their aircraft's superiority, who trained to fight with warrior spirit, and who discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that courage without capability was simply another path to death. The psychological shock experienced by Japanese pilots encountering the Hellcat in 1944 was rooted in 3 years of systematic defeat that contradicted everything they'd been taught. To understand McCampbell's 90-minute demonstration of American superiority, we must first understand how Japanese naval aviation fell from dominance to helplessness. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval aviators struck the American Pacific Fleet with devastating precision. The attack represented the culmination of years of training, tactical development, and technological refinement. The pilots who launched from 6 Japanese carriers that morning averaged over 800 hours of flight time. Many had combat experience from years of fighting in China. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that outperformed every fighter in the American inventory. The Zero's specifications seemed almost miraculous. Maximum speed of 332 miles per hour, range of nearly 2,000 miles with external tanks, climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute. Most impressively, maneuverability that allowed it to turn inside any Allied fighter, then operational. In the hands of skilled pilots, the Zero appeared invincible, but the Zero's excellence came with hidden costs. To achieve long range and extreme maneuverability, Mitsubishi designer Jiro Horikoshi made radical compromises. No armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structural reinforcement. The Zero was essentially a flying fuel tank, wrapped in thin aluminum with a pilot sitting exposed. One well-placed bullet could ignite the aircraft, killing the pilot instantly. Japanese naval doctrine accepted these trade-offs. Their philosophy emphasized offensive action, decisive battle, and individual pilot skill. Armor was considered unnecessary for warriors who would outmaneuver enemy fire through superior ability. Self-sealing tanks added weight that reduced performance. Structural reinforcement implied defensive thinking inappropriate for an attack force. This philosophy worked brilliantly at first. Through 1942, Japanese naval aviation swept across the Pacific. They destroyed American aircraft on the ground in the Philippines. They sank British battleships off Malaya. They devastated Allied air forces in the Dutch East Indies. Everywhere Japanese naval aviators appeared, they dominated. But each victory carried hidden cost. Elite pilots, irreplaceable products of years of training, died in successful attacks. Aircraft, manufactured by Japan's limited industrial base, were destroyed faster than factories could replace them. Most critically, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed no systematic program to replace pilot losses. Pre-war Japanese pilot training required 3 years. Candidates underwent ruthless selection, with perhaps 5% surviving the program. Training emphasized aerobatics, individual combat skill, and warrior spirit. Graduates accumulated over 800 hours of flight time before operational assignment. The program produced superb pilots in small numbers. This system functioned adequately during peacetime, but proved catastrophic during sustained war. When pilots died, Japan had no capacity to quickly train replacements of comparable quality. The training infrastructure couldn't expand rapidly. The fuel allocation for training was limited. The instructors were often pulled back to frontline duty because their skills were needed in combat. By mid-1943, Japanese training programs had shortened dramatically. What once took 3 years now took 6 months. Total flight hours dropped from 800 to barely 100. Advanced combat training was eliminated. Gunnery practice became theoretical ammunition was too precious to waste on training. New pilots arrived at operational units having never fired weapons at moving targets. The qualitative collapse was catastrophic. Veteran American pilots reported by 1944 that Japanese aircraft flew like students during combat. They made basic mistakes. They failed to maintain proper lookout. They flew predictable patterns. They panicked under attack. These weren't warriors. They were teenagers, sent to die in aircraft they barely knew how to fly. Meanwhile, American pilot training expanded and improved. By 1944, Navy fighter pilots averaged over 500 hours total flight time before operational assignment. They spent extensive time in advanced training units, learning combat tactics from instructors who rotated back from frontline squadrons. They practiced gunnery until achieving consistent accuracy. They studied gun camera footage from actual combat. Each American pilot represented an interchangeable component in a systematic training pipeline that produced thousands of competent aviators annually. If a pilot was killed, another arrived within weeks of comparable ability. The assembly line approach to pilot production proved as revolutionary as the aircraft they flew. The industrial disparity proved equally devastating. America's aircraft production capacity dwarfed Japan's by factors that seem almost unbelievable. In 1944, American factories produced 96,000 military aircraft. Japan managed 28,000 despite total national mobilization. The Hellcat alone, a single fighter model from a single manufacturer, saw over 12,000 units produced during the war. Grumman's factory on Long Island operated with assembly line efficiency borrowed from automotive manufacturing. Interchangeable parts, standardized production techniques, quality control at every stage. A new Hellcat rolled off the production line every few hours. Each aircraft met exacting specifications. Each engine was essentially identical. Maintenance was simplified because parts were truly interchangeable. Japanese aircraft production remained largely traditional. Each Zero required extensive hand-fitting of components. Engines needed individual adjustment. Quality varied significantly between factories. As the war progressed and experienced workers were drafted, quality declined further. By 1944, new Zeros often arrived at operational units with mechanical problems that would have been unacceptable in American aircraft. The Hellcat's design incorporated lessons learned from 3 years of Pacific combat. Early American fighters like the Brewster Buffalo and Wildcat had struggled against the Zero's superior performance. American pilots died learning the Zero's weaknesses through brutal trial and error. But those lessons weren't wasted. Grumman engineers studied captured Zeros. They interviewed surviving pilots. They analyzed combat reports. They identified specific requirements for a Zero killer. The result was the F6F Hellcat, an aircraft purpose-built to exploit every Japanese weakness while negating their advantages. The 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine gave the Hellcat a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to climb with the Zero and exceed it at altitude. While Japanese engineers struggled with supercharger technology, American engines maintained power output to extreme altitudes. Above 20,000 feet, where much combat occurred, the Hellcat dramatically outperformed the Zero. The heavy armament of 650 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute with muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. Total firepower exceeded 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. Concentrated in the nose, all 6 guns fired through the propeller arc, creating a cone of destruction that shredded enemy aircraft. The Zero's armament combined 2 20mm cannon with 2 7.7mm machine guns. The cannon shells provided impressive explosive power, but slow muzzle velocity created trajectory problems. Pilots had to aim differently for cannon versus machine guns, complicating gunnery. Limited ammunition of 6 rounds per cannon forced fire discipline that reduced practical rate of fire. The small machine guns lacked stopping power against armored American aircraft. More critically, by 1944, most Japanese pilots lacked the gunnery skill to use their weapons effectively. American pilots reported Zero attacks where streams of bullets passed harmlessly by, the Japanese pilot unable to judge deflection or lead properly. These weren't veteran aces conserving ammunition. These were poorly trained replacements who'd never learned proper gunnery technique. The armor protection that Grumman built into the Hellcat saved countless American lives. 212 pounds of steel plate surrounded critical areas. The pilot sat behind armor that could stop 20mm cannon shells. Additional armor protected the oil cooler and engine. Bulletproof glass 3/4 of an inch thick formed the windscreen. Self-sealing fuel tanks used multiple layers of rubber that expanded when punctured, preventing fuel leaks and fires. American pilots routinely returned from combat with bullet holes throughout their aircraft. The Hellcat's robust construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy a Zero instantly. One documented case saw a Hellcat return to its carrier with over 200 bullet holes from Japanese fire. The pilot was uninjured. The aircraft was repaired and flying again within 3 days. A Zero with similar damage would have exploded in mid-air, killing its pilot before he could even consider returning to base. This survivability created a psychological confidence in American pilots that Japanese aviators could never match. Americans knew their aircraft would protect them. They could press attacks knowing a few enemy bullets wouldn't necessarily kill them. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics that Japanese pilots in their fragile Zeros couldn't match. By October 1944, when McCampbell shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in 90 minutes, he was merely demonstrating realities that had existed for over a year. The Hellcat was superior in virtually every metric that mattered: speed, climb rate, firepower, protection, reliability. The only advantage the Zero retained was low-speed maneuverability, and American pilots simply refused to fight at low speeds. Energy tactics, maintaining speed and altitude advantages, became doctrine. American pilots were explicitly instructed never to dogfight with Japanese aircraft. The technique was simple: spot the enemy from above, dive through the formation at high speed, fire short bursts, zoom back to altitude using superior speed, repeat until the enemy was destroyed or fled. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese pilots trained for traditional turning combat found themselves unable to engage enemies who refused those terms. They would see an American fighter dive past, guns blazing, then watch helplessly as it climbed away faster than they could follow. By the time they maneuvered to pursue, the American had regained altitude and was positioning for another attack. The frustration was maddening. Japanese pilots possessed aircraft capable of winning turning fights, but the Americans wouldn't turn. They possessed warrior spirit and courage, but courage couldn't compensate for 400-mile-per-hour speed disadvantage. They flew with dedication and determination, but determination couldn't make their obsolete tactics effective against systematic American methods. The battle McCampbell fought on October 24th illustrated these dynamics with brutal clarity. 40 Japanese fighters initially engaged 2 Hellcats. By traditional calculations, numbers should have provided overwhelming advantage, but those numbers meant nothing because Japanese pilots couldn't coordinate their attacks effectively. They couldn't communicate through their inferior radios. They couldn't adapt tactics mid-combat. They simply flew into a systematic execution, where American technology and training created an insurmountable advantage. Consider the mathematics of the engagement. McCampbell expended approximately 2,398 rounds to destroy 9 aircraft. That's roughly 266 rounds per kill. Each engagement lasted between 2 and 6 seconds of actual firing time. This efficiency reflected both American gunnery training and the Zero's vulnerability to concentrated .50 caliber fire. Japanese return fire during the engagement achieved nothing. Not a single bullet struck McCampbell's Hellcat. This wasn't luck, it was the result of systematic advantages. American pilots approached from positions where Japanese aircraft couldn't effectively return fire. They attacked at speeds where Japanese gunnery solutions became impossible. They broke off before enemies could maneuver into firing position. The engagement also illustrated another factor rarely discussed: fuel management. McCampbell's half-full tanks at takeoff gave him perhaps 90 minutes of combat time. He used every minute, pushing his aircraft to fuel exhaustion. Japanese pilots, flying aircraft with shorter endurance and worse fuel efficiency at high altitudes, began running dry much earlier. Several Japanese aircraft that McCampbell shot down may have simply run out of fuel while fleeing, their pilots forced to ditch in the ocean. The psychological impact of such one-sided defeats on surviving Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. Men who had trained to be warriors, who believed in their aircraft and their spirit, discovered themselves helpless against an enemy who treated aerial combat as an engineering problem rather than a test of courage. Their worldview collapsed. The mythology of Japanese aerial superiority, carefully cultivated since the Zero's debut in China, shattered. Saburo, Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, encountered similar dynamics throughout 1944. Though Sakai was not present at McCampbell's October engagement, his experiences illustrated the broader collapse of Japanese naval aviation. On June 24, 1944, Sakai approached what he believed were Japanese fighters near Iwo Jima. Only when he was extremely close did he realize his mistake. They were 15 American Hellcats. What followed became legendary among Japanese pilots. For over 20 minutes, Sakai evaded every attack from 15 Hellcats, using every ounce of his immense skill to survive. He twisted, turned, dove, climbed, and exploited every performance advantage his Zero possessed at low speeds. When he finally landed at his base, his aircraft had not a single bullet hole. He'd survived through sheer mastery of his aircraft, but Sakai himself recognized what this victory represented. He'd survived but accomplished nothing. He couldn't fight back effectively. He couldn't drive off the attackers. He could only evade until the Americans broke off, presumably because they'd expended ammunition or needed to return to base. One veteran pilot in an obsolete fighter surviving through defensive maneuvering demonstrated nothing except the desperation of Japan's situation. Sakai later reflected that the Hellcat destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. This statement from Japan's most successful surviving ace carried devastating weight. It wasn't just that the Hellcat was faster or better armed, it represented a way of war that Japan couldn't match. Systematic, industrial, technological, American, the contrast between Sakai's experience and McCampbell's achievement is instructive. Sakai, perhaps Japan's most skilled pilot with decades of experience, needed every ounce of ability to survive 20 minutes against Hellcats he couldn't effectively engage. McCampbell, a skilled but not supernatural pilot, destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft in 90 minutes of sustained combat while taking no damage. The difference wasn't individual ability, it was systemic advantage. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were explicitly instructed to avoid combat with American fighters when possible. Intelligence reports circulated warning that engagement with Hellcats should only occur when possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and advantageous position. This admission that Japanese pilots should run from American fighters represented complete reversal of the warrior ethic that defined Japanese naval aviation. Pilots trained to seek combat at every opportunity, to prove their courage through aggressive action, were now told to flee. The psychological impact was devastating. Young pilots arriving at operational units discovered their seniors were terrified of the enemy. The mythology of Japanese superiority, which had sustained morale through early victories, collapsed into bitter recognition of inferiority. The institutional knowledge that made early Japanese naval aviation so formidable disappeared with catastrophic speed. By October 1944, most of the pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor were dead. The veterans of the China campaigns were gone. The aces who dominated 1942 had mostly been killed. Squadron commanders were now men with perhaps 200 hours of combat experience, leading units of teenagers with barely 100 total flight hours. This experience gap created death spirals. Inexperienced pilots made mistakes that got them killed quickly. Their deaths further depleted unit experience. Replacements arrived even less prepared. The average quality declined continuously. Formations that once operated with precision now flew ragged and confused. Tactics that required coordination became impossible to execute. American intelligence officers analyzing captured Japanese documents discovered training manuals that described combat techniques, requiring capabilities Japanese pilots no longer possessed. instructions for complex formation maneuvers that demanded hundreds of hours of practice, gunnery techniques that assumed ammunition availability for extensive training, tactical doctrines built on assumptions of rough parity with enemy forces. None of these assumptions remained valid by late 1944. Japanese pilots flew obsolete aircraft. They lacked fuel for adequate training. They faced enemies with overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. Yet military doctrine demanded they continue attacking, continue sacrificing themselves in battles that achieved nothing except adding to casualty lists. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which provided the context for McCampbell's record-setting mission, represented Japan's last attempt at conventional naval victory. The operation committed virtually every remaining Japanese warship to a complex multi-pronged attack on American invasion forces. The plan required coordination between widely separated forces, precise timing, and success at every stage. It also required air cover that Japanese naval aviation could no longer provide. American carrier aircraft swarmed Japanese surface forces. Without effective fighter protection, Japanese ships faced continuous attack from Hellcats, Dauntless dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes. The battleship Musashi, largest warship ever constructed, absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before sinking. Multiple other Japanese capital ships were sunk or damaged. The entire operation collapsed into catastrophic defeat. McCampbell's achievement on October 24th was merely one small component of this larger disaster. While he and Rushing shot down 15 Japanese aircraft, other American fighters destroyed dozens more. The coordinated defense of Task Force 38, using radar detection and fighter direction, created an impenetrable aerial shield that Japanese attacks couldn't penetrate. After Leyte Gulf, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an offensive force. The carriers that survived had aircraft but no trained pilots. The pilots who survived had no aircraft or fuel. The entire structure of Japanese naval air power, built over decades, had collapsed in 3 years of attrition warfare. It had no capacity to win. The final months of the war saw Japan's aviation reduced to kamikaze attacks. This desperate tactic explicitly recognized that Japanese pilots could no longer win conventional aerial combat. Converting the pilot and aircraft into a guided missile, sacrificing both to inflict damage, was Japan's admission of complete conventional defeat. Young pilots with barely enough training to take off and fly straight were sent on one-way missions because teaching them actual combat tactics was pointless. They'd simply be shot down before applying them. Saburo Sakai, that most skilled of Japanese pilots, actually flew on what was intended to be a kamikaze mission in July 1944. Ordered to escort suicide bombers to American carriers near Iwo Jima, he was expected to crash his Zero into enemy ships after the bombers attacked. But when his formation encountered Hellcats that shot down nearly all the suicide bombers, Sakai chose survival over suicidal obedience. He broke off, flew into a storm cloud, and returned to base with his Zero intact. This decision, to preserve himself and his aircraft rather than die meaninglessly, represented yet another fracture in Japanese military culture. The warrior ethic demanded death before dishonor. But Sakai recognized that throwing away his life and aircraft accomplished nothing except satisfying an obsolete code. Better to survive, to preserve his skills and experience, to potentially train others, or defend Japan more effectively another day. Sakai's pragmatism contrasted sharply with the institutional rigidity that characterized late-war Japanese military operations. Young, pilots were still taught that warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They were told that courage and determination mattered more than technology or numbers. They were sent into combat believing mythology rather than confronting reality. When these young pilots encountered Hellcats in combat, the mythology shattered instantly. No amount of spirit prevented 50 caliber bullets from tearing through their unarmored aircraft. No determination allowed their obsolete fighters to catch enemies 400 miles per hour faster. No courage compensated for 300 hours less training than their opponents possessed. The death toll was staggering. Japan lost over 90% of its naval aviators during the war. Thousands of young men, many barely out of school, died in aircraft they couldn't effectively operate against enemies they had no chance of defeating. Their courage was absolute. Their sacrifice was total. Their deaths accomplished nothing, except demonstrating the futility of continuing a war Japan had already lost. American veterans often expressed sympathy for their Japanese opponents. Pilots like McCampbell, who destroyed 9 aircraft in one mission, recognized they weren't fighting skilled adversaries in fair combat. They were executing poorly trained teenagers in obsolete equipment. There was no honor in such slaughter, no warrior's glory, just the mechanical application of overwhelming advantage against helpless victims. One American pilot's combat report from October 1944 stated simply, "Engaged enemy fighters, multiple bandits destroyed, opposition ineffective." Japanese pilots appeared confused and unable to execute coordinated defense. Several aircraft showed signs of battle damage or mechanical failure before engagement. Enemy pilot quality noticeably degraded from previous encounters. This clinical assessment captured the reality of Pacific air combat by war's end. Japanese pilots weren't warriors anymore. They were casualties waiting to happen. Their presence in the sky was ceremonial, a gesture toward military resistance that meant nothing against American forces that had achieved such complete superiority that combat had become execution. The technological revolution represented by the Hellcat extended beyond mere performance specifications into fundamental changes in how nations approached aerial warfare. The contrast between American and Japanese development philosophies revealed deeper truths about industrial democracy versus military autocracy, systematic innovation versus traditional craftsmanship, and the ultimate triumph of material reality over spiritual mythology. When Grumman began developing the Hellcat in mid-1942, the design process incorporated feedback loops impossible for Japanese industry to replicate. Test pilots flew prototypes and provided detailed reports on handling characteristics, performance limitations, and combat suitability. Engineers analyzed combat reports from frontline squadrons, identifying specific weaknesses in existing aircraft that needed correction. Manufacturing specialists ensured designs could be mass-produced efficiently without sacrificing quality. This systematic approach treated aircraft development as an iterative engineering problem rather than artistic creation. Each prototype incorporated lessons from the previous version. Problems identified during testing received immediate attention. Combat experience drove continuous improvement. The result was an aircraft that evolved rapidly from initial concept to operational excellence. Japanese aircraft development, constrained by limited resources and institutional rigidity, couldn't match this pace of innovation. The Zero that fought in 1945 was essentially unchanged from the aircraft that attacked Pearl Harbor. Minor improvements addressed specific problems, but fundamental redesign proved impossible. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the engineering workforce, and the institutional flexibility to revolutionize their fighter designs mid-war. The A6M50, introduced in autumn 1943, featured slightly better diving speed and modified exhaust stacks. These incremental improvements meant nothing against American fighters that had evolved dramatically. The Hellcat itself went through multiple variants during production, each incorporating combat-proven enhancements. The F6F model that McCampbell flew in October 1944 featured improved engine performance, better armor protection, and enhanced weapons capability compared to earlier versions. This continuous improvement philosophy extended throughout American military aviation. Problems didn't remain problems. They became engineering challenges with systematic solutions. Pilots complained about cockpit heating in European operations. Engineers redesigned the environmental system. Gunnery accuracy needed improvement. Hydraulically boosted controls were installed to improve high-speed maneuverability. Each issue received attention, analysis, and correction. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, flew essentially the same aircraft throughout the war, while watching them become progressively more obsolete. They understood their disadvantage with painful clarity. Combat reports from late 1944 explicitly state that Japanese pilots recognized American fighter superiority and understood their own aircraft's fatal limitations. But recognition changed nothing. Japan couldn't produce better fighters in meaningful numbers. Their industrial base couldn't support rapid development and deployment of advanced aircraft. The Kawasaki Ki-102, Japan's attempt at a twin-engine fighter comparable to the P-38 Lightning, entered production in early 1945, 4 years after the Lightning became operational. Only 238 were built before war's end. They were slower than American fighters, climbed poorly, and suffered chronic engine problems. This technological lag wasn't due to Japanese engineering incompetence. Their engineers understood aerodynamics and propulsion theory as well as Americans. The problem was industrial capacity and resource availability. American aluminum production in 1944 exceeded £3 billion. Japan managed roughly £600 million despite total mobilization. The aluminum required for a single Hellcat, approximately £2,000, exceeded monthly allocations for some Japanese factories. This material constraint meant Japan couldn't build aircraft in numbers sufficient to compete, even if designs had been equivalent. The petroleum situation proved equally catastrophic. American refineries produced enough aviation fuel to support unlimited training and operational flying. Japanese fuel production, crippled by submarine warfare against tankers bringing oil from conquered territories, forced severe rationing. Training programs received minimal fuel allocation. Operational units sometimes couldn't fly because fuel wasn't available. By late 1944, many Japanese aircraft sat idle, not from lack of pilots or planes, but from lack of fuel to put them in the air. This fuel shortage created cascading failures throughout Japanese aviation. Pilots couldn't train adequately. Units couldn't maintain operational tempo. Aircraft engines, running on increasingly poor quality fuel, suffered accelerated wear and mechanical failures. Even when Japanese pilots reached combat, their aircraft often performed below specifications due to fuel quality issues that reduced engine power and reliability. American pilots never faced such constraints. Fuel was unlimited. Training could incorporate hundreds of hours of flight time. Operational units flew as much as needed. Aircraft received proper maintenance with correct lubricants and high-quality fuel. This systematic logistical superiority proved as decisive as technological advantages. The radar-directed fighter control system that vectored McCampbell to his intercept on October 24th represented another dimension of American advantage. This integration of detection, communication, and command control transformed carrier defense from individual initiative to coordinated system. Radar operators detected incoming raids at extreme range. Fighter directors analyzed threats and positioned defenders optimally. Radio communications allowed real-time tactical guidance during engagements. Japanese carriers lacked effective radar, reliable radio communications, and systematic fighter direction. Their combat air patrols operated independently, relying on visual detection and individual initiative. This meant Japanese fighters were often poorly positioned when enemy strikes arrived. They couldn't coordinate defensive responses effectively. They fought as individuals rather than as integrated system components. The SK Air Search, radar installed on American carriers, detected aircraft at 100 miles with reasonable accuracy. The SM height-finding radar determined altitude within 500 feet. This information flowed to combat information centers where trained officers plotted all contacts on vertical display boards, creating comprehensive tactical pictures impossible with visual observation alone. Fighter director officers, watching these displays, could vector defending Hellcats to intercept points with precision. Vector 270, Angels 2-5, Bandits 60 miles, closing gave pilots exact heading, altitude, and range to enemy formations. This systematic approach maximized defensive efficiency by concentrating fighters where threats existed rather than dispersing them in random patrols. Japanese Type 21 air search radar, when it worked, provided perhaps 60 miles detection with frequent false contacts and no altitude information. Without integrated fighter direction, Japanese combat air patrols flew predetermined patterns, hoping to visually spot incoming raids. This reactive approach meant Japanese fighters were often too far away, too low, or too high when enemy strikes arrived. The communication technology gap amplified these problems. American VHF radio equipment provided clear voice communications despite electromagnetic interference from dozens of simultaneous transmissions. Pilots could talk to their wingmen, to flight leaders, to fighter directors, maintaining constant tactical awareness. Japanese radio equipment produced constant static, feedback, and interference. Many pilots simply turned their radios off, relying on hand signals and visual cues that worked adequately in training but failed catastrophically in combat chaos. This communication breakdown prevented tactical coordination that American pilots took for granted. When McCampbell engaged 40 Japanese fighters, he maintained radio contact with Rushing throughout the battle. They coordinated attacks, called out threats, and supported each other through voice communication. The Japanese pilots they fought had no such capability. Each fought alone, even when surrounded by squadmates, unable to warn others of threats or coordinate defensive responses. The cultural dimension of Japanese naval aviation's collapse deserves examination beyond purely technical factors. The warrior ethos that defined the Imperial Japanese Navy created psychological frameworks that prevented effective adaptation to changing circumstances. Concepts like Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized spiritual strength, loyalty unto death, and acceptance of sacrifice. These values served samurai warfare well, but proved catastrophic when applied to industrial age conflict. Japanese military training emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and spiritual cultivation over tactical flexibility. Pilots learned to follow orders without question, to maintain formation regardless of circumstances, to value honor above survival. These cultural imperatives created forces that fought with tremendous courage, but couldn't adapt when circumstances changed. When tactics that worked in 1942 failed in 1944, cultural rigidity prevented development of effective alternatives. American military culture, influenced by democratic traditions and pragmatic engineering mindsets, emphasized results over process. Tactics that didn't work were abandoned. Formations that proved vulnerable were modified. Equipment that failed was replaced. This cultural flexibility, combined with institutional structures that allowed information to flow upward from combat units to development organizations, created adaptive capacity that Japan couldn't match. One specific example illustrates this cultural difference. When American pilots discovered the WWII, a defensive maneuver using two aircraft sections to provide mutual support, the tactic spread rapidly throughout naval aviation. Pilots taught other pilots. Training programs incorporated the maneuver. Within months, it became standard doctrine. No formal approval process was required. Good ideas propagated organically because the culture valued effectiveness over tradition. Japanese aviation never developed equivalent adaptive capacity. Tactical innovations required formal approval through hierarchical command structures. Changes to doctrine faced resistance from officers trained in traditional methods. Good ideas from junior pilots were often dismissed as presumptuous. The institutional culture valued established procedures over experimental adaptations, creating stagnation that proved fatal when fighting enemies who continuously evolved. The aftermath of McCampbell's October 24 mission rippled through both American and Japanese aviation communities. For Americans, the engagement confirmed what was already known: the Hellcat's superiority was absolute. McCampbell's 9 kills in one mission became legendary, but the deeper message was systematic. Properly trained pilots in superior aircraft, supported by effective command and control, could achieve kill ratios that seemed almost unbelievable. Air Group 15, McCampbell's command, would eventually be credited with 315 aircraft destroyed in aerial combat and 348 more destroyed on the ground. They sank nearly 300,000 tons of enemy shipping. These staggering totals reflected not individual heroics but systematic superiority applied consistently over 7 months of continuous operations. For Japanese aviation, October 1944 marked the effective end. The losses at Leyte Gulf, hundreds of aircraft and pilots destroyed, could not be replaced. Training programs were already shortened to the point of futility. Industrial production couldn't keep pace with attrition. The fuel shortage prevented adequate training, even if time and instructors were available. Japanese. Naval aviation didn't collapse suddenly. It eroded steadily until nothing effective remained. The kamikaze tactics adopted after Leyte Gulf represented explicit admission of conventional failure. By converting pilots into guided missiles, Japan acknowledged its aviators could no longer win air-to-air combat. Young men with barely 100 hours of flight time were sent on one-way missions because teaching them actual combat tactics was pointless. They'd simply be shot down by Hellcats before applying any training beyond basic aircraft control. The human cost of this systematic destruction defies comprehension. Thousands of Japanese pilots died in 1944 alone. Most were barely out of school, rushed through abbreviated training, and sent into combat in obsolete aircraft against enemies they had no capability to defeat. Their courage was absolute. Their determination was total. Their deaths accomplished nothing except demonstrating the futility of continuing a war already lost. One captured Japanese document from December 1944 stated, "Current pilot training produces aviators capable of basic flight operations only. Combat capability is minimal. Engagement with American fighters results in consistent catastrophic losses. Pilots report feeling helpless against enemy aircraft that exceed zero performance in all critical parameters. Morale is extremely low. Continued operations under current conditions serve no military purpose." This brutal honesty, buried in internal documents never meant for public view, captured the reality Japanese leadership refused to acknowledge publicly. The war was lost. Continuing cost Japanese lives with no hope of changing outcomes. Yet military culture and political considerations demanded continued resistance regardless of cost. American intelligence officers who interrogated Japanese pilots after surrender discovered widespread recognition of technological and training inferiority. These men understood they'd been sent to die in hopeless battles. They knew their aircraft were obsolete. They recognized American pilots were better trained. Yet military discipline and cultural imperatives demanded they continue fighting. The psychological trauma of surviving when so many died haunted these men for decades. Saburo Sakai, that most skilled survivor, spent post-war years reflecting on lessons learned. His writings described the cruel reality of war, where courage without capability was meaningless. He became an advocate for Japanese technological development and industrial advancement, arguing that Japan must never again fall behind in critical technologies. His experiences facing Hellcats taught him that warrior spirit alone couldn't overcome material disadvantage. Sakai's post-war relationship with American pilots he'd fought against revealed the complex humanity beneath wartime enmity. He became friends with Harold Jones, the rear gunner who nearly killed him over Guadalcanal, in August 1942. They met multiple times, discussing their shared experiences with mutual respect. Sakai never expressed bitterness about his defeat or Japanese aerial losses. He simply acknowledged that America had waged war more effectively. This recognition that America's systematic approach to warfare proved superior to Japanese spiritual emphasis influenced post-war Japanese development profoundly. The nation that embraced Bushido and warrior traditions underwent cultural transformation, adopting industrial efficiency and technological innovation as new national priorities. The humiliation of technological defeat drove determination to never again be surpassed. David McCampbell, meanwhile, continued his naval career after the war. He commanded the carrier Bonhomme Richard, served in multiple staff positions, and retired as a captain in 1964 after 31 years of service. His 34 aerial victories made him the Navy's all-time leading ace. His 9 kills in one mission on October 24, 1944, remained an American record that has never been equalled. But McCampbell rarely discussed his achievements in detail. Like many combat veterans, he understood that his success came partly from facing poorly trained opponents in obsolete aircraft. There was no glory in such one-sided slaughter. His skill was undeniable, but the systemic advantages that made his achievement possible mattered more than individual prowess. In oral history interviews conducted late in life, McCampbell emphasized the Hellcat's qualities and the effectiveness of American training over personal heroics. He praised his ground crews, his wingmen, the entire support structure that kept Air Group 15 operational. His humility reflected understanding that no individual, however skilled, could have achieved what he accomplished without the systematic advantages American forces possessed. The technological lessons from the Pacific Air War influenced post-war aviation development worldwide. The importance of pilot protection, integrated radar systems, systematic training programs, and continuous improvement processes became established doctrine. Nations developing air forces studied the American approach as template for building effective military aviation. The Soviet Union, which had focused primarily on Eastern Front operations during the war, absorbed these lessons carefully. Their post-war fighter development emphasized ruggedness, firepower, and pilot protection characteristics the Hellcat had proven essential. Soviet training programs expanded dramatically, incorporating systematic methods borrowed from American practices. Even the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established after occupation ended, built aviation capabilities using principles learned from their defeat. They emphasized technological excellence, systematic training, and integration of sensors and communications. The lessons written in Blood Over Pacific Skies influenced Japanese military thinking for generations. The F6F Hellcat continued serving long after World War II ended. During the Korean War, Hellcats flew ground attack missions, their robust construction and heavy armament proving valuable for supporting ground forces. The aircraft that had dominated Japanese Zeros now destroyed North Korean and Chinese positions with rockets and bombs. Some Hellcats remained in service with reserve units into the mid-1950s, a remarkable longevity for a World War II fighter design. The final production Hellcat rolled off Grumman's assembly line in November 1945. Total production reached 12,275 aircraft. These Hellcats were credited with destroying over 5,200 Japanese aircraft, roughly 19-to-1 kill ratio in confirmed aerial victories. No other fighter in history achieved comparable combat effectiveness over sustained operations. This success ratio reflected not just aircraft quality, but the entire systematic approach to carrier aviation that America developed during the war. The Hellcat was one component of an integrated system, including radar detection, fighter direction, excellent training, superior logistics, and continuous improvement based on combat experience. Remove any component and effectiveness declined. Together, they created an unbeatable combination. The historical irony of McCampbell's October 24th achievement deserves final reflection. 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed by one Hellcat in 90 minutes represented not exceptional heroism, but routine application of overwhelming advantage. That such one-sided victory could occur demonstrated how completely American forces had surpassed their opponents by late 1944. Japanese pilots who fought that day understood the hopelessness of their situation. They knew their aircraft were obsolete. They recognized their training was inadequate. They understood that continuing to fight accomplished nothing except adding to casualty lists. Yet military discipline and cultural imperatives demanded they continue attacking, continue dying, continue the futile resistance. The young Japanese pilot who died in the first Zero McCampbell destroyed that morning was probably 20 years old. He'd likely accumulated less than 150 hours total flight time. He'd never fired weapons at aerial targets during training. He flew an aircraft designed in 1938 against an enemy using 1944 technology. His courage in climbing into that Zero and flying toward American carriers deserves recognition even as we acknowledge the futility of his sacrifice. 15 Japanese pilots died during McCampbell and Rushing's engagement. 15 families received notification that their sons, brothers, or fathers would never return. 15 more gaps appeared in squadrons that couldn't fill them. 15 more, confirmations that Japan had lost the war in the air and couldn't recover. The American perspective, triumphant and justified by victory, sometimes obscures these human costs. Young men on both sides showed tremendous courage. Japanese pilots flew obsolete aircraft into hopeless battles with full knowledge they'd probably die. That they did so anyway, that they maintained military discipline, even as their situation became increasingly desperate, reflects courage as genuine as anything displayed by American aces. But courage without capability was, as Sakai recognized, ultimately futile. The Pacific Air War proved that industrial capacity, technological innovation, systematic training, and adaptive tactics determined outcomes. Individual bravery mattered, but it couldn't overcome the massive systemic advantages America possessed by 1944. The morning of October 24, 1944, when David McCampbell shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in 90 minutes, marked a historical moment where these realities achieved perfect clarity. One skilled American pilot in a superior aircraft, supported by excellent training and systematic command and control, could dominate 40 enemy fighters that lacked comparable advantages. The mathematics of warfare had shifted decisively. Technology and industrial capacity had overwhelmed traditional military virtues. This transformation didn't diminish individual courage or skill. McCampbell's achievement required both, but it demonstrated that modern warfare rewarded systematic advantages over individual prowess. The nation that could produce better aircraft, train more pilots, develop superior tactics, and integrate these elements into coherent systems would dominate conflicts regardless of enemy courage or determination. Japan learned this lesson through catastrophic defeat. Their warrior traditions, their emphasis on spiritual strength, their belief in individual combat superiority all proved inadequate against American industrial warfare. The Zero that had seemed invincible in 1941 was obsolete by 1943. The pilots, who had terrorized Allied forces in 1942, were mostly dead by 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation, once the finest in the world, ceased to exist as effective military force by war's end. The Hellcat that McCampbell flew that October morning represented America's response to the Zero's early dominance. Superior through systematic development, mass production, continuous improvement, and integration into effective tactical doctrine. The aircraft embodied industrial democracy's advantages: flexibility, innovation, resources applied to military problem-solving with devastating effectiveness. When McCampbell landed aboard USS Langley with his engine sputtering from fuel exhaustion and just 2 rounds remaining in one gun, he demonstrated something beyond individual achievement. He'd shown what systematic superiority looked like when applied by capable hands against overmatched opponents. His 9 kills weren't miracles, they were predictable results of properly leveraging overwhelming advantages. The Japanese pilots who died that morning weren't defeated by superhuman enemies. They were defeated by systemic factors: obsolete aircraft, inadequate training, poor communications, ineffective tactics, and complete absence of the technological infrastructure that might have allowed them to compete. Their courage couldn't overcome these disadvantages. Their determination couldn't compensate for 300 hours less training than their opponents. Their warrior spirit couldn't stop 50 caliber bullets from tearing through unarmored aircraft. The final assessment must acknowledge both triumph and tragedy. American forces developed the systems, technology, and capabilities necessary to achieve total air superiority. This achievement deserves recognition as remarkable accomplishment in engineering, training, and operational art. But the human cost thousands of young men on both sides dying in combat tempers any celebration. War's brutality doesn't discriminate based on which side possesses technological advantage. David McCampbell's record 9 kills in a single mission will likely never be broken. Modern air combat, with its beyond visual range missiles and radar-guided weapons, doesn't create opportunities for such extended engagements. His achievement stands as testament to a specific moment in aviation history when technology, training, and circumstances aligned perfectly. But the deeper significance of October 24, 1944, extends beyond individual records. That day demonstrated the culmination of 3 years of systematic American effort to achieve aerial supremacy. The Hellcat, the training programs, the radar systems, the tactical doctrines, the industrial capacity, all these elements working together created such overwhelming advantage that combat became execution. Japanese pilots who survived the war carried memories of helplessness against enemies they couldn't effectively engage. They remembered watching squadmates die without being able to help. They recalled the terror of being hunted by aircraft they couldn't outrun or outclimb. These psychological scars reminded them that courage alone couldn't overcome systemic disadvantage. American pilots who fought these battles often expressed sympathy for their opponents. They understood they weren't defeating elite adversaries in fair combat. They were executing poorly trained teenagers in obsolete equipment. There was no honor in such killing, no warrior's glory, just the mechanical application of overwhelming force against helpless victims. The lessons from the Pacific Air War resonated through subsequent conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars each saw emphasis on technological superiority, systematic training, and integrated command and control. The model developed during World War II, where industrial democracy mobilized resources and capabilities that authoritarian opponents couldn't match, became template for American military operations. The Hellcat's dominance over the Zero represented not just aircraft comparison, but clash between different approaches to warfare. Japan's emphasis on warrior traditions and individual prowess couldn't compete with American systematic engineering and industrial production. This pattern repeated throughout the war across all domains. American forces applied resources and organization that Axis powers couldn't match despite frequent advantages in individual soldier quality or tactical skill. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of October 24, 1944 began with 2 Hellcats launching from USS Essex to intercept 60 Japanese aircraft. It ended, 90 minutes later, with 15 enemy planes destroyed, a record that still stands, and another demonstration that the war in the air was already decided. Japan had lost. The only question remaining was how many more young pilots would die before military leadership acknowledged reality. David McCampbell's 9 kills that morning told a story beyond individual achievement. They narrated the triumph of industrial capacity over warrior spirit, of systematic innovation over traditional methods, of technological superiority over courage and determination. These lessons, written in smoke and blood across Pacific skies, influenced military thinking for generations. The Zero fighter that had terrorized Allied forces in 1941 became symbol of obsolescence by 1944. The pilots who flew Zeros understood their disadvantage but flew anyway, driven by duty and culture and military discipline. Their courage deserves recognition, even as we acknowledge the futility of their sacrifice against enemies who possessed such overwhelming advantages that the outcome was never in doubt. The Hellcat that shot them down represented America's arsenal of democracy, industrial production, technological innovation, systematic training, and adaptive doctrine combined into instruments of warfare that authoritarian opponents couldn't match. This systematic superiority, more than any individual battle or achievement, determined the Pacific War's outcome. When the smoke cleared and the last Zero fell into the Philippine Sea that October morning, the demonstration was complete. American naval aviation had achieved such total supremacy that Japanese pilots were no longer combatants but casualties, their presence in the sky more ceremonial than threatening. The shock Japanese pilots experienced when encountering the Hellcat was really the shock of confronting modernity itself, systematic, industrial, technological warfare that made traditional martial virtues irrelevant. That shock reverberated through Japanese military thinking, ultimately contributing to decisions that ended the war. When warrior spirit couldn't overcome material disadvantage, when courage couldn't compensate for technological inferiority, when determination couldn't change mathematical realities, the foundations of Japanese military culture cracked. The Hellcat, more than any specific battle, demonstrated that the age of the samurai warrior had truly ended. David McCampbell's 90 minutes of combat on October 24, 1944, captured this transformation perfectly. One pilot, one aircraft, overwhelming advantages, 9 enemies destroyed. Not through supernatural skill, but through systematic application of superior technology, training, and tactics. The record stands not as miraculous individual achievement, but as demonstration of what happens when systemic superiority meets overmatched opposition. The Japanese couldn't believe one Hellcat could shoot down 9 fighters in 90 minutes, but belief meant nothing. Reality, demonstrated through burning Zeros falling from the sky, proved indifferent to what anyone believed. The mathematics of warfare had shifted. Technology and industrial capacity had eclipsed traditional military virtues, and by October 1944, this shift had become so complete that the outcome was no longer in question. Only the final casualty count remained to be tallied.